A date? Zarion and Anala at the southern beach. The weather was still stormy when they left the Guildhall. Zarion instinctively pulled off his vest and put it over his head so both he and Anala could keep relatively dry. Later, when Anala had to shift from his back, he used his rope to rig some kind of makeshift umbrella with the vest. So long as they stuck close together, they wouldn't get wet. Or so long as Zarion didn't run out of mana. Zarion and Anala finally reached the southern beachfront a decent while after they left the Guildhall. It took them a little while longer than normal to get there, since Zarion kept taking detours to avoid more crowded streets. Stopping for a moment, Zarion lifted his right hand up and touched the vest. "Bah! Soaking wet!" he said calmly. He hadn't looked at Anala for more than a few seconds, even once the whole way here. The road they were on had many buildings on the north side of the road, and nothing but a beach on the south side. As a result, there were a lot of people in swimsuits and a lot of people in general wandering around, but not nearly as many as there would normally be because of the pouring rain that had yet to completely clear up. Zarion was kind of quiet the whole way along, and finally decided it was time to say something. I have to admit something. I didn't have any particular place in mind, and I didn't think this would be never mind. But I'm really happy you accepted, and I know that the street has a lot of nice restaurants, he said, turning to face her with a slightly nervous smile. Look, there's one right there, he said, pointing at a building a bit further down the road. There were a good number of people walking around. This is a famous beachfront, but the building he pointed out looked to not have many people entering or exiting. It wasn't very often that Anala went out into the town during the day, and she'd accepted Zarion's invitation to grab some food. She was suspecting to have stayed in the guild. Yet here they were, taking a stroll through the rain. It would have been a lot easier for Anala to have stayed dry had she been able to just remain in her cat form the whole time. Unfortunately, spending any more time in that form would have been tiresome for her, so for most of the walk, Anala had actually been back in her normal beastkin form. Seeing as Zarion was creating a makeshift umbrella for them to make use of, Anala was still keeping herself slightly closer to him than she would have normally. That isn't to say that she was able to hold herself together properly, though. Even as she followed behind him, her ears were pressed down against her skull meekly as her face flushed red. Since the two of them left the guild, Anala had only said about as many words as Zarion, which is to say nothing at all. Looking at them from the outside perspective honestly must have been a rather interesting thing to witness. An awkward young man slowly leading a blushing and shivering young woman through the streets in a rainstorm. When Zarion finally spoke up and stopped, Anala nearly crashed right into his back. Thank God for the quick reflexes.
I felt bad for yelling at you.
Her words were honestly about as meek as you could imagine as she clenched her hands at the fabric of the black sundress.
You were just trying to help, after all.
Once Zarion mentioned the restaurant and lifted his finger up to point at it, Anala once again went silent as a mouse as her gaze followed at Zarion's finger. She really didn't know what she was supposed to do in a situation like this. After all, it wasn't like she'd ever really been on a date before. So what could you really expect from her? Instead of responding with the proper answer, Anala instead just blushed an even brighter shade of red as she nodded her head. Zarion walked with Anala to the building, he pointed out, a restaurant called Candlelit. Zarion gulped and paused a brief moment to look down at Anala, noticing how timid she looked. He instinctively wanted to try to comfort her, as he would anyone else, but he wasn't sure how to comfort a girl. Just do something, idiot, he thought as he moved his hand to try to touch her shoulder. He couldn't do it though, and decided instead to just say something. However, "Don't worry," was all he could manage. With that, he went inside the building with her. It was a relatively quiet place with only a few others around. It looked like a brand new restaurant, so that might explain how few customers there were. That aside, this place seemed to have a very romantic table setup, and Zarion wasn't prepared for that. The staff took Zarion's vest and showed them to their seats. As they sat facing each other, Zarion shifted his gaze around frantically, trying not to look her in the eyes. But he couldn't resist, and gave her one single glance before looking away again. So, I don't think we really had a chance to introduce ourselves to each other. I'm Zarion Hermano. Before Anala had a chance to respond, a waiter came up to take their order. I'll have some pasta. Any kind you'd serve I'd be okay with, he said, finally looking at Anala, his eyes settling on her ears. When the two of them got into the building, Anala was pretty quick to realize just what kind of setting the restaurant, the slightly dim lighting combined with the warm colors of decor, really give off a romantic vibe. Almost instantly, Anala's face got about 3 shades brighter as her tail curled around her leg, her ears pressing down into her hair. It wasn't so much that she was embarrassed about being out on a date as it was the location that the date was taking place. This honestly seemed like a much more serious situation than just a simple date. It didn't take long for the waiter to take Zarion's soaking wet vest and see them to their table. And needless to say, the entire walk was one of the most awkward things she has had to go through since getting to Wento. Possibly even worse than the whole Stoa situation just half an hour ago. If the awkward walk to the table wasn't bad enough, following the whole situation up with an awkward silence between the two of them, that lasted a good probably 5 minutes until Zarion finally worked up the courage to say something. So, I don't think we really had a chance to introduce ourselves to each other. I'm Zarion Hamano. It wasn't much, but an introduction was at least something for them to start off with. But before she had the chance to respond to him, the waiter was back and asking for their orders. Anala couldn't help but just sink a bit further into her seat as Zarion made his order for a thing of pasta. Once the waiter scrawled down the vague order, he turned over to look at Anala. "What about you, Mom?" he asked rather calmly, the words causing a bit of a jolt to run through her entire body.
Do you have Vena?
As she ordered, she couldn't help but press her ears even more firmly against her skull as she prayed that the restaurant actually had her favorite type of fish. It would at least provide her some sort of escape from this awkward hell. She didn't even know what the waiter said before he turned on his heels and walked off toward the back. The fact that he didn't ask for more questions must have meant that they did in fact have it. But now that he was gone again, the table was left silent as Anala forced herself to look across the table to Zarion.
I'm Anala. Anala N.
She had managed to get the words out, but within seconds she was burying her face in her hands to avoid showing just how red her face actually was right now. Zarion's eyes remained fixated on her ears for several seconds as she gave her order. "Those ears. Cute," he muttered. He meant for it to be too quiet for her to hear, but with the relative silence of the restaurant, she'd probably be able to hear him quite clearly. This, however, was the furthest thing from Zarion's mind. Noticing how timid Anala looked, Zarion squeezed his eyes shut and resolved himself to say something reassuring. If he could work up even a little courage, then the ball would begin rolling from there. Or at least that's what he thought. "Don't worry, I'm nervous too, but I'm here with you," he said, completely unsure if that would help out or not. Regardless, he recalled something from one of his former crewmates had told him about picking up girls. He took in a deep breath and squeezed his eyes shut again before blurting out, "Anala's a very pretty name. I love it!" With that, his face flushed red, and he immediately regretted opening his mouth to begin with. I'm sorry for being so loud," he said, his eyes returning to rest on her ears. "Your ears. You seem so nervous. I must have only made it worse. I'm sorry," he spoke quietly after calming himself somewhat. Hearing Zarion's muttering about her ears being cute sent a jolt through her entire body as she just sunk even further down into her hands. Even if your average person could have just made out what he had said under his breath, being a beastkin, the soft words may well have been spoken as normal. The whole situation made her wish that she didn't already use her transformation in the guild. Though all things considered, it was probably the better time to use it, as it got her out of a crowd. As her thoughts spiraled in circles about what she managed to get herself into, she honestly almost missed Zarion's comment that he was here for her. And surprisingly, her shaking stopped when she heard those words. Softly, she pulled her hands away from her face as she turned her eyes up to look at him, still of course with tears in her eyes from her own self-inflicted panic. But at least she didn't seem to be freaking out. She blinked a few times as she tried to figure out how to tell him that it wasn't so much the situation itself that had her in a panic. Her ears softly pulled away from her head as she watched Zarion squeezing his eyes shut tight. Then, as she started to open her mouth to speak, Zarion blurted out his admiration without a moment's hesitation. "Anala's a very pretty name. I love it!" Needless to say, Anala didn't have a way to respond to that kind of declaration, and was once again struck silent. At first it wasn't that big of an issue, but within seconds, Anala picked up on something that Zarion probably wouldn't. People from many different tables, and even the waitstaff had stopped what they were doing, and turned their attention to them. Feeling so many people watching her and mumbling to themselves about what she could only imagine they thought was going on, caused her face to flush a bright red that would match Zarion's. All she wanted to do was cry or disappear from the table right then and there. So much so that once again fresh tears began to well up in her eyes as her hands moved to cover her mouth, in a meager attempt to hide her desperate mewing. She didn't even hear Zarion's apology as she threw her gaze back down to stare at her silverware. Her mind was back into its endless loop of panic just as she pulled herself out of it. Had it not been for the familiar voice of the waiter chiming into the conversation, Anala likely would have just started to flat-out cry. "Yo pasta, sir," he said as he set down a platter of spaghetti topped with a vibrant red beady sauce in front of Zarion, before placing a plate with a pair of white fish fillets covered in a collection of spices and herbs. "And your vena, ma'am." Quickly, Anala looked up from the table and glanced around the room. Most of the people had stopped paying attention to the two of them and had gone back to eating their own meals.
Thank you.
She whispered out in as loud a voice as she could manage without whimpering again. Was there anything you would like to drink today?" the waiter asked as he looked between the two of them, a small knowing smile on his lips as he crossed his hands behind his back, patiently waiting for the two of them to answer.
Well, water is okay.
Zarion was watching Anala for a while before the food came. He even noticed the few seconds where she looked like she calmed down a bit, but realized it would be strange if he repeated himself and decided against doing so. As his food arrived, he heard Anala ask for water and followed suit. "Yeah, I'll have water too," he said, before taking it in and letting out a deep breath to further calm himself. As the waiter walked away to get their water, Zarion started to eat his pasta, and surprisingly for a former pirate, he ate the pasta pretty much normally, though it looked like he certainly wasn't very used to eating it that way, as he was struggling a bit with the fork. As he was trying to get some of the pasta off on his fork, he glanced up at Anala. "So, why did you join the guild?" he asked in a calm voice. He looked to be getting somewhat frustrated with the pasta, then glanced left at his shoulder, which still had the rope. He gave a very slight smirk and used magic to twirl the pasta tightly around his fork, and grinned triumphantly before taking a bite. When he finished chewing, he then turned his mouth towards Anala, a couple of loops of his coil of rope sliding down his shoulder, the end of the rope hitting the floor. But he didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "As for me, I couldn't find any other place to make money doing what I'm best at, while still having a lot of freedom," he said, using his magic to twirl the spaghetti again, but this time the rope at their feet also swirled in a circle, moving slower than the pasta on his plate, and gently, slowly brushing the front of Anala's foot. Zarion still didn't seem to notice. The rope continued coiling around until it was wrapped around one of the table legs, as Zarion took another bite. Anala couldn't help but draw in a long breath as the waiter walked off. It didn't really make the conversation any more private, but not having someone standing right next to the table certainly did help make her feel more relaxed. Now that things finally seemed to be calming down around them, Anala was able to happily smile to herself as she used her silverware to cut a piece of her fillet and pop it into her mouth, in a much more refined manner compared to Zarion. Pretty much just as she had got the fish in her mouth, though, Zarion asked his question about why she joined the guild. At first, she was a little bit flustered as she wasn't really in any sort of position to answer with him with a full mouth, but thankfully he decided to give his own reason first, which managed to give her time enough to finish chewing and swallowing the delicious fish.
I just wanted a home.
She was very careful about the tone in her voice as she spoke. While she wanted to make sure that no one at any of the tables could hear her, she barely spoke loud enough for Zarion to have heard her.
I really didn't have anywhere.
Just as she had been finishing her sentence, she felt something touch her against her bare foot. The shock of the sudden sensation causing her to practically shout in surprise as she jumped in her seat, her knee banging up into the underside of the table. After that surprise, Anala's ears were now standing bolt upright as her tail puffed up and coiled around the leg of her chair. Though that surprised expression quickly faded when once more she noticed all the eyes from the other patrons. Who could really blame them for getting curious when someone just outright shouted at the top of their lungs? It didn't really make her feel any better though, and pretty quickly her ears were once more pressed down against her scalp as she sunk her shoulders down. Once again, Anala looked like she was on the verge of tears, but this time she didn't actually manage to start to cry, and instead she just brought one of her hands up to press against her forehead as she let out a soft mewing whine.
Sorry, something surprised me.
She might not have actually had anything to apologize for, but it was a holdover from her past life. Whenever she acted out, she would always be expected to apologize, and this situation really brought that feeling back up. If that on its own wasn't bad enough, however, her beast-like hearing could pick up the soft snickers from the other tables, along with soft, barely audible banter about how strange the two of them were. That was all it took for Anala to just simply fall silent, her feet pulling up from the floor as she curled herself into a tight ball in her chair, her arms tightly hugging against her legs as she buried her face in her knees, in a meek attempt to hide herself from the eyes of everyone in the building. Zarion blinked in surprise, with a stray noodle hanging out of his mouth as Anala shouted. Looking around, his mind started racing. Anala, are you okay? He said, placing his hands on the table, about to get up and see what's wrong, then seeing her sink back into her chair, and speak so softly. He felt like he had to do something. Looking around at all the other patrons, he listened to her speak before silently swallowing the last bit of spaghetti he had hanging from his lips, and standing up without a word. He looked at his left shoulder, realizing now that the rope had fallen and it was probably his fault that this had happened. He stepped around the table and stood next to her. He felt his heart start racing as he lifted his hand and placed it gently on her shoulder, and he started blushing. I'm sorry, that was my fault. Are you okay? We can leave if you want. I can pay for the food and we can take it with us. He spoke in a slightly nervous tone. His eyes fell to her ears again. It's okay, I'm here for you, he said in a soft voice that only she could hear. I'm sorry I brought you to such a place where so many people can hear us, he said as he lightly pulled his hand away from her shoulder. Still blushing. Even though his tone hid his nervousness pretty well, his face could not.
At first, Anala wasn't even paying attention to anything around her anymore. It wasn't just that she was too scared to pay attention, but instead that she was actively trying to ignore her surroundings, which really wasn't that easy. Things had been working pretty well at first, until she felt Zarion's hand touch her shoulder. The sudden contact snapped her back to reality and made her want nothing more than to disappear. She was panicking worse than ever as she sat there curled in her chair, her heart pounding as she tried to decide what to do. Would it be better to just stay silent, or should she up and run? When she heard him apologize to her, however, her mind started to relax as her shoulders loosened up. She tried her best to slow her breathing to a normal pace as he continued to comfort her, and before too long, she actually managed to calm herself down. Softly, she started to speak without lifting her head from her knees, which, needless to say, left her muffled and almost inaudible.
I'm so sorry. I'm just not good around people. They look at me, they talk about me. I always feel like...
She didn't finish that thought, and instead just shook her head against her knees as she swallowed down a lump she could feel rising in her chest. She stayed silent for only a little bit longer before she once again started to talk, this time as she lifted her head out from her knees.
I think that...
As her eyes finally pulled away from her own body and fell upon Zarion, she just went silent as the majority of the color pulled from her face. She had actually been getting along pretty well with Zarion, better than she had gotten on with pretty much anyone since she had been abducted as a little girl. He was actually able to make her come down from her panic, and she was just starting to think that maybe, just maybe, getting to know him wouldn't be too bad. So why did he have to have that symbol hanging from his belt?
Pirate?
She whispered out in a meek, no, a scared tone as tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't even look up at Zarion or wait for him to respond before she practically pounced out of her chair, jumping clean over the table as the chair clattered against the ground. There wasn't even a delay as she touched the ground before she started off at a full sprint for the door, her only thought now being a need to get as far from him as she could. The entire outburst happened faster than most people were even able to properly figure out what happened. And by the time the waiters realized she was bolting, she was already in the doorway and sprinting out into the rain as fast as she could. She didn't know where to go, given the fact that if she went back to the guild now, she was likely just going to be running into another needlessly noisy situation. She didn't even pay attention to where she was running as she ran down the street. Though the moment she spotted an alley, she took the chance to make a sharp turn in a hopeful attempt to get away before Zarion managed to get close to her. Thanks to the nasty weather though, Anala instead found herself sliding across the ground and into a wall as she lost her footing in a puddle. Despite the fact that it had been pouring rain and she wasn't in anything more than a sundress, Anala didn't even stand up from her crash. Instead, she just shifted her position into a curled up sitting position and lowered her head. She knew that going back to the guild was just going to cause more problems at the moment, and since she couldn't turn into a cat in order to slip away without drawing attention to herself, she decided that staying in the alley and praying that Zarion didn't find her was going to be the best solution. What she didn't realize though was that her rather panicked run for the street had drawn a crowd that now stood outside the alley. a good 10 people watching her curiously as they argued about going to see what was wrong with her. Zarion noticed her staring at his Jolly Roger before she suddenly jumped out of her chair. He stood there, lips slightly parted, as he watched Anala sprint off at top speed.
Wait!
He called after her, but it was too late. She was gone. Taking a moment to think of what to do next, he decided his best option would be to follow her, and he started running after her. On the way out, he managed to grab his vest. One of the staff started after him, yelling at Zarion to pay for his food.
Sorry, I'll pay you later,
He said as he stopped at the doorway, looked both directions, and didn't see Anala anywhere in sight. Thinking fast, as the staff were about to catch him, his rope shot upwards, and he snagged the roof of the building and used it, in combination with his magic, to hoist himself up onto the roof. As soon as he got his footing, he started running to get a good survey on the surrounding area.
Where'd she go?
He said, panic in his voice, before spotting a group of people gathered around an alleyway that was just out of his sight. Zarion continued running across the roofs and jumping from one to another, taking the most direct route to get to the small crowd, hoping his hunch was right. As he reached the roof of one of the buildings bordering the alleyway, he slowed down and took quieter steps. Peering out from the roof, he spotted her! Silently, Zarion started to descend from the roof. He slipped and almost fell, but caught himself by the rope, and used it to descend lightly and land softly on his feet. Turning around to look at Anala, he walked towards her with the quietest, gentlest steps he could muster, despite the attention of the crowd now being focused on him thanks to his rather dramatic entrance. He said nothing as he stood next to her, before glancing down at his own belt as rain poured down on both of them. He used his magic to make that makeshift umbrella again, without so much as a sound to alarm Anala, and then put the umbrella over their heads again. He couldn't find words, so instead, he waited for her to notice his presence, and as soon as she did, he pulled the Jolly Roger from his belt, a sparkling blue gem popping out from the cloth and rolling across the ground a bit. Zarion's rope immediately went limp and landed on their heads. Well, mostly his head. He quickly pulled the vest off his face and took note of where his Falky went, before giving her a slight smile.
I'm not a pirate anymore. And even if I was, I would never hurt someone like you,
he said, softly, looking into her eyes as he held the small Jolly Roger in front of her.
This is a keepsake from the people who raised me, nothing more,
he said, the smile fading from his lips slightly, as he stuffed the Jolly Roger in a satchel at his side.
You shouldn't be out here alone in that dress. You'll get sick,
he said, genuine concern in his voice, as he took a deep breath and offered her his hand. As she sat there in the rain, Anala honestly didn't pay even the slightest bit of attention to the crowd that had gathered around the street. All she wanted was to wait the little bit of time it was going to take for her to reactivate her polymorph and sneak back to her room in the guild. Of course, things were not going to work out that easy for her. Before all that long, she heard someone walking up towards her, the gentle tap of their footsteps, hardly audible, over the pouring rain that was falling all around them. Still, she didn't move though. Even if some random person came up to her, they were probably just curious as to what was going on. At least that had been her first thought. When she noticed that the rain was no longer beating down on herself, she couldn't help but lift her head, only to once again see Zarion standing over her. Her first instinct was to run. Before she had the chance to make a break for it though, she was suddenly thumped in the head by a rather soggy rope. It was enough of a surprise to pull her attention away from trying to run away, and instead to just listen to his words as her arms squeezed her legs a little bit tighter. It all made sense to her too, and honestly, that just made it all the more hard to think about. If he did really want to do something to her, then he probably wouldn't have gone out of his way to stand up to someone like Stoa. Everything she knew about pirates, though, told her that they weren't people to trust. Once Zarion finally finished speaking and offered his hand to Anala, she just sat there and blinked for a moment before narrowing her eyes slightly. Quickly, she shot one of her hands up to grab onto his wrist as tightly as she could manage, which at the end of the day really wasn't all that tight. Almost in one move, After that, she pulled herself up and pushed her other hand against his chest without letting go of his wrist.
It's all Pirate's fault.
As far as the first thing to respond to someone with those probably were not the best she could have chosen in this situation, but honestly, she wasn't thinking all that much right at this moment.
It's because of them.
As she continued to speak, her words only got softer and softer as tears poured down her face, thankfully, mostly hidden thanks to the rain that also streaked down her face.
I want to believe you. I want to trust you, but if were a pirate...
After that, she stayed quiet as she kept her hand pressed against his chest, as a sort of precaution against him wrapping her in a hug. Gradually, she started to calm down before she finally thought about the last thing Zarion had said as he offered her his hand. Her dress. Softly, she turned her attention down towards her chest, and, lo and behold, the fabric was absolutely soaking wet and clinging to every subtle curve of her body. That would have been enough to have caused Anala to freak out right there. Add to that, however, the fact that as per usual, Anala wasn't actually wearing anything underneath the dress, and her entire face suddenly flushed a bright red as she pulled herself away from Zarion in the blink of an eye. Her arms quickly wrapped around herself as she did what she could to hide her chest from him. Though as much as she might have wanted to, she wasn't able to hide her entire body, and the clingy fabric of her dress was clearly showing every other curve of her tiny body.
Will you turn around already?
She meowed out pitifully as she fidgeted on the spot, her tail tightly wrapping itself around one of her legs as she cast her eyes down to the ground. Zarion watched Anala's face carefully as she spoke to him, and even though nobody else would probably be able to tell, due to their distance, he could tell she was crying. When she was finished speaking, he thought the only thing he could do was to try to comfort her. But with her hand on his chest and the other hand holding his wrist, he could only think of one thing to do. He could feel his heart rate increasing as he slowly lifted his left hand to touch her cheek. As his face turned red slowly, just as he had committed himself to doing it, she suddenly pulled away and started to cover herself. Zarion blinked a couple times. Her covering up her chest drew his attention to the rest of her body, and he started blushing even more.
Anala,
he said, averting his eyes when she said to turn around. He wasn't sure whether to try and comfort her or to just do as she asked, but eventually, he smiled to himself and turned around. But that's not all he did. He removed his shirt and then picked up his vest, shaking it off before putting it back on, then turned back around and took a single long stride towards Anala, placing the shirt that would definitely be oversized for her into her arms.
Wear this. Maybe they won't notice,
he said as he stood between her and the crowd, turning to face them and yelling at them.
Oi! Can't a couple get some peace and quiet? Go on, get lost!
He yelled out at them. Most of the crowd went about their business. Zarion turned to Anala once more and suddenly tripped on an upturned piece of the ground and cut himself on the wall, hands on either side of Anala, and forehead inches away from her hair. He suddenly felt very nervous and started jumbling out sentences that barely made sense.
Sorry, I fell and I tripped. I didn't mean to,
he said. Anala softly let out a sigh of relief when Zarion turned around. Having to deal with pretty much see-through dress on top of everything else that was going on wasn't really what she was wanting right now. As she tried to calm herself down from the mild panic she had already needed to deal with, Anala never actually noticed that Zarion turned back towards her and pulled his shirt off. Thankfully, though, in that time, she didn't actually stop covering her chest. What really put her back to her senses was Zarion gently pushing the shirt against her.
Wear this. Maybe they won't notice.
Softly, Anala moved one of her arms so she could take hold of the wet shirt, which she quickly hugged tightly against herself, using it instead of just her arms to hide her body. When Zarion turned away from her, Anala started to open up the shirt in an attempt to slip it over her head, while he was turned away. Though, when she heard what Zarion screamed back towards the crowd, she once again froze up.
Oi! Can't a couple get some peace and quiet? Go on, get lost!
She just stood there for a second as she gawked at him, She didn't know if he actually considered the two of them to be a couple, or if he was just trying to make an excuse for the crowd.
Couple? I mean, I know I went on a date with him. That's not it. He's probably just... What if he really meant it though?
Her thoughts went around like that in circles, right up until Zarion turned back around towards her, only to trip as he did so, knocking her backwards ever so slightly, so that she was up against the wall once again, before catching himself. Thanks to the way that they bumped into each other, Anala was still holding Zarion's shirt down at her stomach, as she stared up at him with wide eyes. She wasn't even thinking about it, as her face began to flush a bright red from ear to ear. But thanks to the way they managed to land against the wall, Zarion wouldn't have any trouble seeing right through the sundress that was clinging tightly to her every curve. The only thing Anala could think about, though, was Zarion. I mean, she knew that he was an adventurer now, and before that, a pirate, but she couldn't believe the fact that he was just... She might have been standing there in shock for a good few seconds before reacting, but all at once, she snapped back to her senses, her arms pulling back to her chest to press the shirt against her as some form of cover. Quickly she shot her gaze down towards the ground, so she didn't need to stare at Zarion. All the while, both her ears and tail stood stiff as the fur frizzed up, making them seem much poofier than normal. Zarion could feel his heart beating fast as he froze up there, and she looked up at him with wide eyes, and he stared back. His heart was beating so fast that his breath was coming out in light panting, rather than normal breathing, and he felt a little lightheaded. Perhaps that was why he didn't notice that Anala's clothes were soaked through and he could see everything. Zarion took a few moments to catch his breath and calm himself down. As he was doing this, however, he noticed something about her. Her ears were standing up so straight, and they were so poofy looking. Zarion slowly brought his right hand down from supporting him on the wall, and reached down and poked her ear. Not just once, but multiple times. His face started to flush red as he did this, and then suddenly, he reached down and scratched gently behind her ear. Luckily, the crowd had pretty much dispersed by now, thanks to his earlier outburst, and nobody was really paying attention to this scene. Zarion closed his eyes and let out a breath as he did this. He needed to calm down a little, but for some reason, he couldn't help himself. He just had to do this. The moment that she felt Zarion's finger ever so gently poke her ear, Anala's ear flitted about excitedly for a moment as she felt a jolt run through her entire body. The same things followed again and again, each time Zarion poked her ear. Despite how she was most of the time, Anala honestly wasn't pulling away from him. Her blush was still as bright as ever, but she wasn't so much as voicing a complaint about the touching. In fact, almost the opposite could be said as Anala started to purr. It wasn't very loud yet, and would likely be more than drowned out by the rain splashing against the stone alleyway. It didn't take long for Zarion to move on from simply poking her ear to softly scratching it, just where it met her skull. Feeling the more constant stimulation really felt amazing, and just from the way that Anala's ear began to flit about more happily as her tail began to sway softly, it wasn't hard to tell that she was enjoying herself. Her purring was also slowly but steadily getting even louder as she enjoyed herself, a tiny smile spreading over her face as her toes playfully curled and uncurled on the cold, wet stonewalk. If this situation had continued much longer, Zarion would have undoubtedly realized what he was doing and pulled away in a panic. However, before he could, Anala was the one to move. Without even giving it so much as a thought, Anala dropped the shirt down at her feet before pushing herself up against Zarion's stomach, her hands in small fists on either side of her head, as she flattened herself up as tightly against him as she could, with her body pressed so tightly against Zarion. There was no way he wouldn't be able to notice the purring, as even if he couldn't hear it, he would feel it. The only occasional break in the happy rumbling being when she took the occasional long, deep breath through her nose. The crowd that had been watching them just moments before, the helplessly awkward situation she had been in at the bar in the guild. At this moment, none of them were even on her mind. The only thing she was thinking about now was just how wonderful the scratching at her ear felt, and the wonderful smell that kept filling her head with each deep breath. Her tail was still swaying slowly and steadily back and forth behind her as she shifted herself ever so slightly, her hands moving from his stomach up to grab tightly on his vest as she pulled down towards her head. Zarion opened his eyes. He saw her expression. She looked so happy. That was when he realized what he was doing. And just as he was about to pull away, Anala had moved directly into his arms. Zarion opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. As he felt her press up against him, all he managed to get out was an He felt her purring against him, and his mind whited out. He couldn't think of anything right now, which is perhaps why he instinctively wrapped his arms around her, holding her so close to him, feeling her body's warmth in the cool mid-spring rain. He felt the feeling wash over him that he hadn't ever felt before. It was like happiness, but even warmer.
Anala, what is this feeling?
He just barely managed to get out. But that wasn't all. She began pulling on his vest, pulling his head towards her. As soon as he realized what she was doing, his mind started scrambling even more. His mind entered a state of complete confusion.
What do I do? I can't... I just can't screw this up. I gotta do something.
His thoughts rang out in his mind as he stared at her ears, and he completely thoughtlessly stuck his tongue out and licked her ear once. He immediately froze after doing so, eyes wide.
What did I just do?
He thought, as his eyes focused on her ears. He remained frozen, shocked at his own actions. As the two of them stood there, only getting more and more drenched in the rain, Anala couldn't help but enjoy the bliss. At least until she felt an altogether different sensation brush over her ear. In an instant, she snapped just enough back to her senses to confuse her. She stopped her purring as her fingers uncurled from Zarion's vest, before pulling them back down to press gently against his stomach.
What am I?
The words were honestly nothing more than a soft whisper as she tried to get a proper grasp of the situation. The only thing she could really tell was that she was snuggling as tightly against Zarion as she could manage, but she had absolutely no idea why. She didn't pull away from him though, and as much as she hated to admit it, feeling his arms wrapped around her shoulders as she pressed against his stomach wasn't actually that bad. Instead, she just tilted her head up to face his, instantly noticing the surprised and worried look on his face.
Can you let me go now?
This time, Anala tried her best to talk loud enough for Zarion to actually hear her, as her hands ever so gently pushed against his abs. It wasn't a hard enough push to even budge his arms that had been wrapped around her, but it at least would have been enough for him to feel. Zarion was still breathing pretty hard, but upon hearing her voice, he seemed to calm down just a little.
I'm so sorry. It's just you were suddenly so close and...
He managed. Letting go, he put his hand over his heart.
What is this feeling?
He said, quietly, eyes closed, as he took a single step backwards. Zarion smiled a little, still with his eyes closed, as he tried to explain things as best he could.
It's just your ears were all poofy and they're so cute. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I wanted to touch them and I acted without thinking. I'm so sorry. And when you were so close and so warm and purring.
His voice dropped to a low murmur towards the end of his words. Then he opened his eyes. That was when he finally saw. He couldn't help but gawk a little. Seeing a lot of skin on a girl who was showing it on purpose, that was one thing. But this was another matter entirely. Not only did she not mean for this to happen, but in the short time they'd spent together, he'd already started to feel attached to her. And because of that, his eyes were just completely wide for what seemed like forever to him. In actuality, it was only a few seconds. Zarion opened his mouth to speak and managed.
Anala, your chest.
As his face started turning red again. Quickly, he reached down in an attempt to grab the shirt and give it back to her. However, in his lightheadedness, he stumbled, and, while he still managed to grab the shirt, he somehow managed to faceplant onto her chest. At this point, The rain and being wet was the least of his worries. This was the most embarrassed he'd ever felt in his life. Quickly he pushed away from her and fell on his back, hitting his head on the ground.
I'm so sorry,
he muttered as he shook his head, trying to get his bearings. As she stood there in silence, listening to Zarion overly explain what just happened, Anala couldn't help but feel like she was going to melt where she stood. She might not have been happy about it, but being a beastkin, this wasn't the first time her instincts took over her. With every additional thing he brought up, Anala felt like she was being punched right in the chest, her ears sinking down closer and closer to her skull as her tail slowly coiled around her leg. What really got to her, though, was when Zarion finally mentioned that she had been purring. Her ears shot bolt upright, her eyes widened in shock, and her tail tightly squeezed at her own leg, tight enough to actually make a visible sinking in her thigh. She might have been used to having times when her instincts took over on her, but purring when she wasn't in heat, this was a new situation for her. Quickly, she brought her hands up to squeeze at her skull, as if doing that would make what just happened simply disappear from her memory. All it really did instead was make herself look like a bit of a fool. That didn't last all that long though, as Zarion then mentioned her chest. At first, Anala didn't have any idea what he meant. The constant rain beating down on her honestly made her forget all about the fact that she was wearing soaking wet clothes. As much as she didn't want to look down at herself, she knew she had to. Slowly, her eyes drifted down to look at herself, and what she saw made her want to scream. Her dress had gotten so wet that the slightly transparent black fabric clung to even the smallest of her curves. If that alone wasn't bad enough, Anala couldn't help but be reminded of the fact that she wasn't wearing any sort of bra under her dress, as her eyes focused on two rather prominent nubs. As you could likely imagine by this point, Anala wasn't paying attention to Zarion in the slightest. Her panic was fully on herself, as both her ears and tail went bolt still and straightened out. The moment her thoughts caught up with her panic, her arms began to move to cover herself, though what her hands caught hold of wasn't the wet fabric of her dress. It was the back of Zarion's head. Turned out that in his own spurt of panic, Zarion had also jumped into action to try and help her out, only to have tripped and fallen face first into her tiny chest. The whole thing happened too quickly for her to really process as they both fell backwards, Anala practically hugging Zarion's face against one of her tiny breasts, until they hit the ground, at which point she finally let go of him as she let out a rather adorable little yelp of surprise. If only that was it, though, as quickly Zarion pushed himself away from her, only to land himself flat on his back, looking up into the rain.
I'm so sorry.
Thanks in combination to the way that he pushed away and the way they landed, however, Anala's dress was no longer sitting all neatly along her body. Somehow, the dress had gotten bunched up enough that her midriff was bare. If there was any saving grace to the entire situation, though, it would have to be the fact that she wore nothing but panties under her dress, and was instead sitting there on the ground, one leg up while the other was bent beside her, giving Zarion the perfect angle to see her if he was to sit up. Once again, the sudden and unexpected situation had managed to pull Anala from her senses as she sat there dazed, one hand supporting her entire body from behind, as her other one scratched painfully at her scalp as she tried to regain her bearings. Not a single thought put into hiding her absolutely shameless display.
Ow. What in the world happened?
She mewed out softly as her ears tried to get themselves dry by flitting about in just about every direction as her tail began to coil itself around her wrist. Zarion rubbed his head as he sat up, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks for several seconds. But the knock to the head and the few seconds he had to recover snapped him back to his senses as he quickly grabbed his shirt and stood. He walked towards Anala in complete silence. He towered over her for a couple seconds before reaching down and pulling her up by her underarm so that she was standing again, and he continued to act without speaking, pulling his shirt over her head until her head popped through the neck hole. Though he finally spoke once, she was mostly covered up.
Anala, listen to me.
He spoke, putting his hands on her shoulder and touching the bottom of her chin with his finger to lift her head. If he didn't just see what he just saw, this would probably be too much for him, and he needed her to know.
I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but it's all my fault. I'd do anything to make it up to you. Really, anything.
He said, removing his finger from her chin, pulling her into a hug. He almost seemed like a different person entirely, as he let go and walked a few steps away to pick up his Fousey. Turning around, he looked at her again. He seemed sad.
You must hate me after what just happened, so I'll just go. Or I can walk you home, if you prefer, if you're okay with me.
He said, voice quiet and somewhat defeated. When Anala felt Zarion's hand against her arm, it honestly snapped her back to her senses. But before she had the chance to react in any way, she was pulled to her feet. It was enough of a surprise to be yanked up like that, but having this sort of action come from Zarion, who until now had honestly been about as forceful as herself, just left her speechless. Her first worry was that the Zarion she had been dealing with up until this point really was just an act. Her heart began to race as she once again thought about making a break for it. That was when Zarion pulled yet another unexpected action out, pulling the shirt up over her head in a way that actually pinned her arms just in front of her chest. She honestly looked almost comical as she stood there with the shirt over her entire upper body, leaving nothing but a tiny bit of one shoulder and her head visible in terms of skin. The confusion was clear on her face as Zarion started to walk away from her, talking about how he was willing to do anything to make it up to her, and how she must hate him at this point. If only Anala actually had even the slightest idea about how to respond in this situation. She didn't hate Zarion. In fact, of all the people she had interacted with since joining the guild, he was the only one who seemed right. Thanks to that confusion, Anala did nothing as she stood there, her ears only half erect as her tail hung limply behind herself, only barely twitching as it continued to be splattered with rain. It didn't take long for Anala to just close her eyes as she tried to come up with a plan.
Should I tell him that I don't hate him? What if I apologize? That won't help. What if I...
As her brain went round and round, her own internal frustration began to show on her face as her ears slowly folded backwards towards her skull and her face scrunched up. It was about then that something else caught her attention, as once again, that same smell from before filled her head. This time, she could tell instantly what she was smelling, and without even opening her eyes, she moved her hands under the shirt to pull the fabric up to her face as she leaned forward and buried her face into the soft, wet fabric. That smell honestly calmed her down more than she would care to admit as her ears went back to a neutral position and her tail softly began to sway once more. Unfortunately, though it also served to make her seem as though she was either ignoring or shunning Zarion. Zarion watched her carefully. For a moment, he thought she might be about to say something to him, but instead, she pulled his shirt over her head.
She must just want to be left alone. She doesn't want to see me or have anything to do with me.
He thought internally. Zarion let out a slightly bitter-sounding chuckle.
Damn, it looks like you're at least screwed up this time. It's fine, keep the shirt until you get back to the guild. Then you can give it back or toss it, or... It doesn't really matter to me. I'll go now. Bye, Anala.
He said, turning and quickly walking off down the alley, back down the way Anala came, before she had a chance to respond. Zarion turned the corner and immediately stopped and punched the side of the building next to him. Luckily for him, it was made of wood, not stone, and it didn't hurt much. Standing there for a few seconds, tears started to form and roll down his cheeks. He was actually thankful for the rain this time, as it hid it from would-be onlookers. Zarion took quick strides back to Candlelit as he cursed to himself under his breath. When he got there was a guard talking to the restaurant staff. "There he is now! The thief!" shouted someone as the guard turned to face Zarion. Zarion bared his teeth and walked past the guard as the rope flew up and wrapped around his neck, choking him.
I don't have time to play thief right now. Take your damn gold and forget any of this ever happened,
he said, tossing a handful of gold at the staff. He then let go of the guard and pushed the rest of the gold pouch into his hands.
And you as well. I paid my dues, so leave me be. or else next time that rope is snapping your damned neck.
He growled, looking into the guard's eyes before the guard grunted and nodded once, seeming satisfied with the amount of gold he received. Zarion wandered off back towards the guild. At least that's where he was going. He sighed and pulled the job information out of his satchel and finally checked what it was about.
Great, this isn't the sort of work I'm really cut out for, but it's close by. Anything that gets my mind off what just happened.
He muttered, changing course. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-ba. That's all, folks. That's all, folks. Ba-ba-ba-da-da-da-ba. Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Next time, Zarion will be on an epic quest that is super dangerous. What will happen to him? Will he show feelings? Will Anala learn to speak English?
Dang, Zari, you have some kind of ear fetish.